Okay, this section is going to be our first foray into working with dialogue. For this first section, we're going to be working with a talking headshot, so just emphasis on the face, using the mouth to lip sync with the audio, also how to import audio so that we can work with it inside of Harmony, and working with the eyes and facial features. So this is going to be the first step. Eventually, after this, we're going to want to work with the entire body, and in general, it's best to work with the whole body as part of the acting piece, but sometimes we'll be working with a production where this may be a low-budget shot, or there's not really meant to be much happening, and mostly would be working with the head. So, again, this is going to be a talking headshot for this first part of the dialogue, just getting you used to it. So when working with dialogue, we want to make sure that we keep the audio file in the same folder setup as the rest of the supplementary graphics. So before I import the audio, I'm going to first make the file in Harmony. So creating a new file, I'm going to call this Larkspur Dialogue 1. So I'm just naming it Larkspur because that's the name of the character that I'm going to be using. Then I'm going to hit Create Scene. Okay, so once you create the file setup in Harmony, it's going to be placed inside of a folder. So I have Larkspur Dialogue 1 that was just created, and that's right here. So for audio, I'm going to want to import any kind of supplementary material that I'm going to be working with. So I'm going to add, I can call it audio, I can call it dialogue, whatever it is that makes it easy to tell what this is supposed to be, like where it's located. So if it's called dialogue, you would expect to find the dialogue file in there. Same thing with audio, so either one would have been appropriate. So now I'm going to take a copy of the file, the sound file, and I'm going to drag it over there, or copy and paste it over there. So that is, okay, so this is a WAV file.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
So we have our line inside of the dialogue, and this is a WAV file. So when you are acquiring the dialogue, if you are going to be recording any of it yourself, my best suggestion for that would be to make sure that it is saved as a WAV file if possible, or at least to have a version of the WAV file. That way it's going to be lossless. And lossless just means it's uncompressed. It's going to be at its highest quality. We want to do that because eventually if we were to export this with the audio file attached, then there's likely going to be some kind of compression, and you don't want to bring in a compressed file into a program to work with and then compress it again. That would be called like double compression. So it would sound, you would lose quality twice. So it's best to, if you can, have it as a WAV file. Alternatively, you can look for sound files in on the web or dialogue from movies or TV shows. If you're not sure what kind of audio you'd want to work with yet, you can listen to ones that have already been audio that's already been recorded and work with that to practice with. So we have that file. Now if you have any kind of gesture drawings or storyboards or anything that has been that is helpful, like a helpful image reference for you to use. Again, I usually recommend sketching on paper, or you could sketch directly in Harmony. It just depends on what gets your energy or your inspiration going. So for this particular case, this is based on storyboards that I've made a while back. So I'm going to use the storyboard as the gesture drawing. Okay, and once you have the audio in there, then if you have any supplementary material like your gesture drawings or storyboards from another software, or scanned into the computer if you've drawn them by hand, you can create maybe a new folder, and you can call it gestures, you can call it references. I'll just call it reference. And you can also put them in the same folder and maybe call them supplementary material. Anything that's helpful here. So now we have two supplementary items to bring into the file. So I'm going to go into Harmony, import images, and let's grab it from there it is. Okay, and grab the storyboard. Okay, and the image imports in a little bit smaller than the stage. That is not a big deal at all. That's easy to rectify. So right now there's no other graphics in here. If there were, then it would depend on how big the graphics are compared to the stage. That might change our tactic. But since this is the only thing in here right now, all we could really do, or the easiest thing we can do, is we can just create a camera layer by going to the little plus to the right of layers, click on camera, and then we're going to use these advanced animation controls. They're over here towards the top. They may be in a different location on your computer based on either the last person who's used it, if it wasn't you, or what settings you happen to have on it. Sometimes it can be in other locations, like down here. If you do not see it, you can right mouse click anywhere that's a blank gray area. It could be here. Again, it could also be down here. I don't like to put it here because there's already a lot going on near the timeline. So I would just right click here, and it would be under advanced animation. Mine has a check next to it because mine is active. And again, if it does have a check and you can't see it, you can always click on it. It'll disappear. You might see the movement, and then hit it again, and you'll see it pop up. Sometimes that's a way I can find something if there's so much stuff going on my stage, so many icons everywhere. It can be a little hard to find things sometimes, especially if you move them around or if they get moved. It can happen by accident too. So once you have access to it, the one we're going to want is scaling, because we want to scale. I know it's a camera. We're not making the camera bigger, but by scaling, it's like zooming your camera. So that's essentially what we're doing. So I'm going to turn on scale. Now, she got darker, and the reason why she got darker is just because since I'm not in a drawing mode, it's not really paying attention to the fact that I have the light box active. So that's just why it's showing up like that. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. So I'm going to left mouse down and drag. Make this a bit larger. There we go. So now it touches the edges. So now it's a close-up, or the storyboard is the size of our canvas, which is good. That's what we want in this case. So I'm going to go back to drawing, and I'm going to switch to the brush, and you'll see that she's lightened again. Now, if that doesn't happen with you, like if you're on a layer that is not the graphic, and the graphic is not lightening up, that just means that you don't have Lightbox on, or Light Table on, and you can click that off or on. You can have it on or off. There's no right or wrong answer. Whichever one, the purpose of it is to make it something that makes it easier for you to see what layer you're on, while still being able to see the other layers. So I find it helpful, so I usually keep it on, but you can always turn it off. So the other thing I'm going to want to have is her dialogue. Now, one thing about dialogue is that dialogue in a sense, sets the length of your shot. Sometimes when you're working with an animation, you may not know how long something's going to take. But when it comes to dialogue, you usually get a pretty good idea, because it's going to have to at least be the length of the dialogue if the dialogue all happens within that same shot. So kind of times it out for you. I have no idea yet if 60 frames, which is the default starting length of any Harmony file, I have no idea if that's going to be long enough or not. Probably not. But I'll know once I import the dialogue. So I'm going to go to File, Import, and I'm going to go to Sound. And I'm going to go to the dialogue folder. Wow, that actually happenstance just happens to fit into those 60 frames. Perfect length. So it's just happenstance. Okay, so we have the gesture drawing underneath, or the storyboard. And we have the storyboard layer here. I could lock it. I don't know if it's going to be quite necessary. I'll leave it unlocked for now. I have the drawing layer, and that's just what this file started with. Whenever you start a new Harmony file, it's always going to have one drawing layer, so it doesn't have anything in it. And then we have the sound file. Now, if you scrub back and forth, you should be able to hear it. Now, as I scrub back and forth, I cannot hear it. There's nothing. That's just because you have to tell it that that's what you want. And to do that, you just go to the top left of your timeline, and there's what looks like a little speaker with an S. The S stands for scrubbing. Scrubbing just means that it will play the audio as you scrub your time indicator side to side. A little robotic, right? But now it makes it a little bit easier for you to time it out. So you also can turn on the sound in general so that when it plays...
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
it'll play the audio in sync with the visuals. So I have the drawing layer, and I'm just going to rename this head. Now, even though I am making this a talking head shot, Harmony does have a little bit of puppeting ability to it, so there is the chance that we may want to do a little bit of movement with the head. And just in case we decide to do that, I'm going to have the head as a separate layer than her body, and probably the back of her hair, and probably the front of her hair, as a different layer from the head and the body. And that way, if we chose to do a little bit of movement with the head, it's possible. So sometimes that'll happen in a production. If you're working with a file and you're not entirely sure 100% what you want them to do, then it can be helpful to leave yourself some options. If I had the background as one, or the head and the shoulders and the body all as one layer, that makes it impossible to ever add any extra motion unless you wanted to redraw some of it. So just to think ahead, I'm going to have her head separate from her body, and the back of her hair separate from her head and her body, and her bangs separated. That way, if we do add a little bit of motion, it's going to primarily be a talking head shot. But there are some ways that we can simplify head action in Harmony. So let's go up close. I'm going to grab the brush. Let's make the maximum size. I'm going to guess 15, but let's see how it looks. So I want it to roughly be the same thickness as the undersketch. That's pretty good. I'll switch to red because I'm drawing on top of blue lines, just to make sure that's easy to see on top of my sketch. Here we go. And I'm going to go down here. I want to add a little bit of smoothing to my line. So right now we have no center line smoothing. Let's change that. This isn't going to be inked right now. This is just sketched, but just to keep the lines from being too shaky. Let's try 10, maybe 10 instead of 15. Okay, that looks better. Now, when you are inking, I would recommend working with the pencil, because with the pencil you can change your thickness, line thickness, retroactively. But within sketching, it's not that serious. So you might be okay with the brush. Brush is usually recommended for sketching. Pencil is usually recommended for inking, which I know sounds weird, because when you think of inking, you would think pen. And when you would think of sketching, you would think pencil. But that's not how we do here. So I'm going to sketch out her head. And I'm going to sketch out her head as if her hair's not there. Again, just in case we decide to add a little bit of hair action. Not that you will see much of her forehead. Her hair is going to be covering it, but there it is. Okay, so there's her head. And I'm including her nose and her ears. Again, they're anchoring points on her face. Okay, and her head is going to extend the exposure to the end of the document. And let's add her body and the back of her hair. Now, if she does move her head, I would have to keep in mind, like, especially if she lifts her head, where the top of her neck is. I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. I'll worry about it if I do end up moving her head up and it's noticeable. That is something we would really have to be concerned about in inking and coloring. And her arms are covered by her shawl. So I'm not going to have the arms be their own layer. If I did want to do anything with her hands and bring her hands in, that could always be its own layer that I bring in later. So we'll just keep this as one piece now. Extend that to the end. Fn, F5. And then for the back of the hair, okay. Oh, and I drew that on the last layer, doesn't matter. I'll just drag it to the front and it'll extend. Then I'll add a new layer for her mouth. I'm going to do her mouth first. So mouth shapes are interesting. If you were to look up on Google some mouth shape references, sometimes you'll find mouth shape charts, and that can be helpful with getting you started on what kind of mouth shapes we have to think about when we're animating. However, I advise not to stick too tightly to the mouth charts, just because, or at least the shapes that the mouths are making. It's helpful to look at the charts as a reference for what kind of consonants or vowels you might get, or you might have to think about when you're animating your character. But the way that the mouths shape out the words is not a hard, fast rule for every single character. In fact, people, the way their mouths form words varies between each person. Some people don't open their mouths that wide. Some people mumble. Some people smile more. Some people frown more. Some people have wider mouths, or maybe they have an overbite or an underbite. The shapes of their mouths and the shapes that their lips make when they're speaking, which teeth you see, how much of their teeth you see, do you see any of their gums? All of that is really dependent on the character, so that's something to think about. So something that I think about with Larkspur is that she's a smiley kind of character. She doesn't always smile, but she tends to smile. And she tends to be a nervous smiler, so almost like that customer service, grimacy kind of smile. And in this particular shot, she's being polite, but a little bit disconcerted. So I want her smiling, but not an overly bright smile. And let's see what we have here.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
So she's got some pauses. And I think I'll start with her mouth closed, but I am going to use the mouth shape that's in the gesture for probably when she first starts speaking. The. So she's making a the sound, and you can have the tongue come out between the teeth for the. And open her mouth as about the same as it is in the gesture here. It's not much change. Might need to open her mouth a little wider. And now when the mouth is open, something to think about as well is what teeth does your character show when their mouth is open? So some people are a top tooth person. Some people are bottom teeth people. You're not usually going to see both sets, the upper and bottom, at the same time excessively. Maybe if your character's baring their teeth and they're kind of mad, or they're clenching their teeth. You might not see either the top or the bottoms, but usually you'll see one or the other. But again, it depends. And the idea is to be consistent with it. There's no right or wrong. It can be different for different people. It's just being consistent with it. open her mouth up a little bit. But again, I don't want to be too wide. She's just saying the. She's not yelling. Now, one thing we have to be careful of when it comes to dialogue is you don't want to overdo it with too many mouth shapes. If they're talking too fast and their lips are moving too much and over-enunciating, then it can become hard to read and it'll just look like static. So you never really want to have any less than 2 frames per mouth shape, but even then, that's still really fast. So sometimes what we'll do instead is what's called phrasing. So if your character, especially if your character's speaking quickly, but this can happen even if the character's not speaking quickly, unless the word itself is being very tightly enunciated in the soundtrack. But what phrasing means is smearing over, I like to call it smearing too, or blending over, or phrasing over, or skipping some of the mouth shapes for certain parts of the words or certain sounds that we may not, that our lips might realistically blend over anyway. We don't really super enunciate with our lips every single word and every single pop of each and every word. So I'm going to right now leave her mouth as this pose up to about here. I may end up opening it up a little bit more in a later frame, but not changing it much. But we'll see how that looks. I'm going to instead, here she says wind. Wind. So I'm going to add a w mouth shape. So that's usually like an O shape. That erased more than I wanted to. Okay, so in. So that's probably getting the mouth a little bit more close. It's not a closed lip position. A closed lip is kind of specific. That's usually an M or B or P sounds, P. It's shapes that require you to put the lips together. So I try to avoid that unless it's said in the track, because that's a very important mouth shape to the reading of the word. So wind. So I'm going to close her mouth, but not close her lips. Probably the shape she has in the gesture might be good for that one. And let's turn on onion skin. So she says doesn't. 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 So So open, close. Open and a little bit more closed, not fully closed. Doesn't. That's too much, or still too open. Doesn't. Okay, so I may close it a little bit more since there's a little bit of a pause. Still keeping it open, because especially since she's going to say bleed, b, make a B sound, we're going to need that closed mouth consonant for that. So closed mouth consonant, that's just closing the lips. It can be a frown, it could be a smile, it can be wide mouth, short mouth, or like narrow. It could be puckered to an extent. It just needs to be closed. Lips closed, not just mouth closed with lips open. So bleed. Bleh. So we can open the mouth and bring the tongue to the top of the roof of the mouth. Bleh. Bleh. But if the mouth isn't opened that widely, you may not see it. And if you open the mouth super wide to show that, depending on the sounds coming before and after, it might look strange. So it could work very well, and that could be a thing to do. I would say maybe keep in mind what are the mouth shapes that the character's making before and after the L sound if they're going to be making it. So she's going from a bleed, so B-L-E, so closed mouth consonant, to an E with her mouth not being that wide. So I'm probably not going, I'm going to phrase over the L and not show the tongue touching the roof of the mouth. We'll see how it looks. If we don't like it, we can always bring it in. And she draws out that word. So we'll try extending, drawing another frame where the mouth is a little bit wider, so it looks like there's still some movement. That may not be necessary. This may be too much. Okay, and so she's saying sir. So, sir. Actually, let me make this extend a little, because an E can make the same mouth shape. So I'm going to extend this one. FN, F5, and maybe stretch that up. That might be too much. Actually, let's flip that. Flip. And when she ends, she could end in kind of the same expression that she had before. Maybe let's ease into it a little bit. Okay. Even though the dialogue fits into the 60 frames, we might want to extend it and have a little bit of a pause. FN, F5. Okay. Let's take out the storyboard. Oops, I accidentally took out everything. Poke the eyeballs. So it's weird without eyes. But
the wind doesn't bleed, sir. The wind doesn't bleed, sir. The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
okay, so it looks like the syncing's all right.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Could maybe use some in-betweens. Okay. So I'm going to try adding so there may not be tons of in-betweens for this. Just kind of depends. We'll try a little bit here. Let's just open her mouth a little bit without the teeth. I'm sorry, without the tongue. Yeah. Okay, and for this one I'm just going to open the mouth a little bit more. So there's some movement, but she still has basically the same mouth shape. And if that ends up being too much, we could, instead of making the mouth shape wider, we could move this mouth shape back and in between the previous expression in this one. We'll see.
The wind doesn't.
Okay. Let's add in between here. Now, I'm not going to do an in-between with the tongue. Tongues move super fast. So the tongue's just already going to be back in her mouth when she opens it. When she starts opening it here. Okay, and start in betweening between the wide mouth and the bringing the puckering the lips a little closer together. Back to your tongue. Okay. Let's see if that looks any better.
The wind doesn't bleed. The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Okay. Let's add her teeth in here. Doesn't, because she's a top tooth person. And 5. Okay.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
So let's try an in-between in here. And 5.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Okay. Now for a closed mouth consonant, we need to keep that mouth closed at least 2 to 3 frames. So if I did do an in-between between this pose and this pose, I would probably just widen the closed mouth. But I don't think that's going to quite work. Let me try pushing this one back one, this one back one. And then I can try doing the in-between in here and see if it looks okay. Because then the mouth will stay pretty closed, and it will at least be fully closed for those 2 frames. If that doesn't work, we can just keep it closed and just widen the mouth.
Wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Yeah, really here. Let's get rid of that.
Doesn't bleed, sir.
Yeah, took out that in between. It works a little bit better with the closed mouth and then popping it to the vowel. E, the B to the E.
bleed, sir.
So we'll just leave that timing. And here, we'll add the in between. There's barely any change. Okay, and let's add one. Okay. Might adjust that frame. So let's see what it looks like.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir. The wind doesn't bleed, sir. The wind.
Her mouth might get too wide. Let's get rid of this frame. Is that one? This is the one we want to get rid of. It's a little too wide.
The wind does.
Okay, so adjusting these frames so her mouth isn't opening as wide as it does, and I'm easing more into that position so it's not as much of a fold. It's not as jarring, or not as still. Now, when I mentioned that you need to have the mouth shapes the same for at least 2 or 3 frames in order to read, that doesn't mean that it can't be animated on 1s or 2s. It can be. The intent is that the expression or the shape that the mouth is making needs to roughly stay the same. So what I mean by that is if she's going ah, you could ease into it or ease out of it or widen it a little bit. You can still animate it, but the general ah mouth shape needs to stay there. It needs to stay as an ah shape for at least 2 or 3 frames in order for it to read. And especially the closed mouth consonants, you absolutely have to have that for at least 2 to 3 frames. Again, it can still be moving. It doesn't have to be a 2-3 frame hold per se. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It's just that you need to keep the mouth shape, the lips closed for those frames. So whether it's widening or frowning or adjusting a little bit.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir. Sir. Sir.
Okay. I kind of like how quickly she pulls her lips back after that. Maybe ease into the last frame, push these last lips back, and add in between. So it's not much change, just a little bit.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir. The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Okay, just got the little...
The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Now when she goes the second time, well, the first time it's a w sound, but makes the same kind of, roughly the same kind of mouth shape. I had her bottom lip show, so I'm going to do that here too. She's not a character that's meant to have wide lips, but she still has lips, so. Okay, I can fade there. more time.
The wind doesn't bleed, sir. The wind doesn't bleed, sir.
Okay. And if we need to go in, we could move it to on ones or some of these. I'm not sure if it's necessary, though. It might be all right. Okay, so that is adding at least the first stage of mouth shapes. We may want to go in and add more in-betweens to them, but we, most importantly, have the mouth shapes syncing with the most important parts of the audio. Next, we're going to work with the eyes.